Hello everyone, welcome to our lesson on 8.6, which is the last section of chapter 8. 8.6 deals with modeling with trigonometric functions. We're going to do two examples today, and our objective for this first half of the lesson is to interpret and use frequency and to write equations for trigonometric functions if we're given a graph. So because trigonometric functions have a periodic nature, they are useful for modeling oscillating motions or repeating patterns that occur in real life, and some examples of that are sine waves, the motion of a pendulum, and the temperature during the year. Frequency is the reciprocal of the period, and that gives us the number of cycles per unit of time. A sound consists of a single frequency. It's called a pure tone. An audiometer produces pure tones to test a person's auditory functions. An audiometer produces a pure tone with a frequency f of 2000 Hz cycles per second. The maximum pressure P produced from the pure tone is 2 millipascals. Write and graph a sine model that gives the pressure P as a function of the time t in seconds. Well, we know that this is a sine function. We are going to need to find the a value and the b value of this function. Because the maximum of the function is 2, that tells us that the amplitude is equal to 2. And next we want to find our b value, which is determined by the period. We don't know exactly what the period is, but we are given the frequency. So using the frequency, we can find the period of our function. We know that the frequency is 2000 Hz. Since this is a sine function, we know that the period is going to be 2 pi over b. So we're going to substitute 2 pi over b in for the period. So to have 1 divided by a fraction, we are going to take the reciprocal, and this is going to give us b over 2 pi. And then we can just solve our function to find our b value. Now, because we have our a value and our b value, this is going to give us our function, which is, so I get a function of p is equal to 2 sine 4000 pi of t, where t is time in seconds, and p is the pressure. Lastly, we just need to graph our sine model. We want to take our b value and divide 2 pi by that value. This gives you 1 over 2000. Let's put that on our graph. And then we want to always divide into quarters. Since this is a sine function, we always start at the origin, and then at 1/16,000, and then at 1 over 8,000, go up to our maximum at 2. At 1 over 4,000, we go down to our x-axis at 3 over 8,000. Then we go down to our minimum at -2, and then back up to x-axis. There's the graph of our function. Let's move on to example 2. Next, we are going to be writing trigonometric functions. The graph of sine and cosine functions are called sinusoids. And a method to write a sine or cosine function that models a sinusoid is to find the values of a, b, h, and k, where a is going to be the amplitude, 2 pi over b is going to give you the period, h is the horizontal shift, and k is the vertical shift. We are going to start off by writing a function for the sine graph that we are given over here. So just looking at this graph, we know that we have a maximum at 5 and a minimum at -1. What we're going to do first is we are going to find k. In order to do that, we want to find the midline of this function. So what we're going to do, take the y values, add them, and divide by 2. And this tells us that our midline occurs at 2. Therefore, our k is equal to 2. So I'm just going to look at the midline and the y-axis, and I see that the y-intercept of the function is on the midline. So that tells me that I should be using sine for this graph. If your y-intercept occurs at a minimum or a maximum, that tells you that you should be using cosine for your graph. If we use sine here, then we don't have to determine a horizontal shift because it goes through the midline. You could model this function using cosine, but then you would have to find the horizontal shift. So by following that rule of thumb, you kind of avoid finding a horizontal shift. And now we need to find the period of the function. And let's see how long it takes for the function to complete a cycle. So we see that it completes a cycle right here at 4 pi over 8 or pi over 2. And now we're going to set this equal to 2 pi over b to find our b value. And we do this because this is the formula for the period. Because 2 pi over b is the formula for period, and if we set up a proportion like this, then we can find our b value. I'm going to cross multiply, and you find that b is equal to 4. Oh, and I forgot to find the a value. So our a value, so from our midline, we have to go 1, 2, 3 units. All right, now that we have our a, b, k value, and we decided that we use sine, then we can write the equation for this function. F of x is going to be equal to your a value times sine of b x plus your k value. You can check to see if this function is correct using a graphing calculator. Let's do this one more time together. Let's do monitoring progress number 2. We're going to write the function for the sinusoid. We want to first start off by determining whether there is a vertical shift. And we want to take the average of the y values, 2 plus negative 2 is 0, divided by 2 is 0. So the midline is going to be at the x-axis, so that means our k value is equal to 0. Now, because the midline is at the x-axis and we have a minimum of negative 2 and a maximum of 2, our a value is going to be 2. And then just looking at our graph, I'm going to look at the y-intercept, and because it starts at the maximum of the function, then I'm going to use cosine. That's want to check to see if there's a reflection. Because the y-intercept is the maximum, then the function is going to be a positive cosine. If your y-intercept were to be at the minimum, you may have a reflection. Lastly, let's find, and because the y-intercept is at the maximum, that tells me that there is no horizontal shift. So a case in which there may be horizontal shift is if your y-intercept does not occur at the midline or at a minimum or maximum. That is when you would have to determine whether there is a horizontal shift or not. In this case, there is no horizontal shift. And then we just want to find our b term. This function completes a cycle in a length of 2 pi over 3. So we're going to set 2 pi over 3 equal to 2 pi over b. And this tells us that our b value is going to be equal to 3. Now that we have our b value, our k value, and our a value, we can write our function. Y is going to be equal to 2 cosine of 3x. That's it for our lesson for today. Please let me know if you have any questions. I hope you have a wonderful day and take care.